Cole thought he could snatch away 1,500 acres with nothing more than a forged abandonment claim. But when this Texas rancher dug into his father's old papers, he uncovered a document that turned those would-be thieves into his renters overnight. Jack Mercer never imagined that a knock on his front door one Tuesday morning would change the entire course of his life. The sun had barely climbed over Cedar Bluff County, and he was still nursing his first mug of black coffee when a stranger showed up. The man wore a crisp polo shirt and polished leather shoes. Without a hello, without even an explanation, he held out an envelope and said flatly, "You've been served." Jack tore it open and stared at the papers, his eyebrows knitting together. It was an official notice from the Cedar Bluff Estates Homeowners Association, claiming that his 1,500 acres had been lawfully transferred to a development company. The reason? Unpaid HOA dues. Dues he had never agreed to. Dues he didn't owe. He read the document twice, the cold typeface making every word feel heavier. His name was there, his father's name too. And then came the blow. The land, they said, had been abandoned. Jack's jaw tightened. Abandoned? "I mowed the south pasture myself last week," he muttered. By mid-morning, when his neighbor Mark Hensley dropped by to borrow a wrench, Jack was pacing the porch. He handed Mark the notice. "They're saying I abandoned it." Mark scanned the pages, his expression darkening. "This is insane. You're not even part of that HOA. Never signed a single thing," Jack said firmly. "Neither did my dad. I've got the records to prove it." Mark shook his head slowly. "This has Priscilla Whitmore written all over it. She's been scheming for months about getting that land developed." Jack knew exactly who she was. Priscilla had a reputation in Cedar Bluff Estates, polished, calculating, and ruthless when it came to HOA meetings. She never made a move without a plan, and if her fingerprints were on this, it wasn't by accident. That land wasn't just soil and grass. It was his father's legacy, and his grandfather's before him. Every fence post, every grazing pasture, every live oak tree carried a story. His father, Richard Mercer, had poured his life into it, hauling water through droughts, repairing barns after storms, raising cattle with patience forged by weather and hardship. Jack could still hear Richard's voice from the day he handed him the deed. "This land is your family's backbone, son. Treat it like it's alive, and it'll take care of you." Now, some HOA paperwork claimed to wipe away all of that. By noon, Jack was on the phone with the county clerk's office. He spent nearly an hour on hold, tapping his boot on the wooden floor while the hold music droned. Finally, a clerk named Angela Peterson answered. Jack explained the situation, his voice clipped but steady. "Mr. Mercer," she said after checking the records, "there's a recorded sale here. It was filed just last week. Seller listed as Cedar Bluff Estates HOA." Jack tightened his grip on the receiver. "And where does it say in your records that they own my land to sell it?" Angela hesitated. "It doesn't." That was the moment Jack realized this wasn't just a mistake, it was deliberate. Someone had gone to great lengths to make this look legitimate, counting on him to be too tired, too busy, or too slow to fight back. That night, Jack hardly touched his dinner. He sat at the kitchen table, laying the notice beside his own deed. He knew every inch of that property, from the creek bed in the north field to the old oak stump by the south fence. To think strangers could take it on paper without stepping foot on it, it wasn't only theft, it was an insult. The phone rang. It was his younger cousin, Ben Crawford, who lived 2 counties over. "Heard what happened?" Ben said. "You're going to fight it, right?" "You bet I am," Jack replied. "But I've got to figure out how deep this goes and who else is pulling strings." Ben was quiet for a moment. "If Priscilla's behind it, she's got allies on that board. Proof might not be enough. You'll need leverage." Jack barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw strangers tearing up the pastures, pouring concrete where his father once ran cattle. But the more he thought, the more it settled in. They'd made one serious mistake. They figured he'd just roll over. Jack had no intention of letting that happen. Before dawn the next morning, Jack woke not from habit but from a restless mind. The early hours always carried a life of their own, even if it was only in memory. He brewed another pot of strong coffee and stepped out onto the back porch. Mist hung low across the fields, and for a moment it felt like his father was still there, steady and quiet beside him. The Mercer land had never been just property. It was a piece of family identity. Jack's grandfather, Henry Mercer, had bought the first 200 acres in the late 1920s, a time when black landowners in East Texas were rare, and keeping land was even rarer. Henry had endured neighbors who wanted him gone, banks that shut their doors, and droughts that nearly crushed him. Yet he never sold a single acre. By the time Richard took over, the ranch had grown to 1,500 acres, earned through grit and careful deals. Jack remembered riding shotgun in that old Ford pickup, listening to his father point out fields and tell stories. The storm of '72 that dropped a barn roof into the creek, the drought of '83 when they hauled water every day for 6 weeks. This land, Richard would say, isn't worth a thing unless you put yourself into it, sweat, time, heart. That's the only way it means something. Jack had lived by that. He knew every leaning fence post, every patch of fresh spring grass, even the rocky soil that grew wildflowers each May. As he sipped his coffee, his eyes drifted to the north pasture, the boundary with Cedar Bluff Estates, the same neighborhood now claiming his land. When the subdivision first went in, he'd thought little of it. A developer built houses with tidy lawns, families moved in, and weekends filled with backyard barbecues. His father had warned him, though. Once you've got boards and committees, they'll try to control more than what they bought. Jack hadn't believed it, until now. The battle for land in Cedar Bluff County had always been quiet. Families lost it to unpaid taxes, shady deals, or by being tricked into signing away mineral rights. What happened to Jack was just a sharper, modern version. No threats, no guns, just paperwork. That afternoon, Jack drove into town to see his aunt, Margaret Fields, the family historian. Her small brick house smelled of lavender and old books, every wall lined with framed family photos stretching back nearly a century. She hugged him at the door, then frowned. "Jack, what's wrong? You look like someone knocked the wind out of you." "They're saying I don't own the ranch anymore," he told her, explaining the notice and supposed sale. Her eyes flashed behind her glasses. "That's Richard's land, your grandfather's land. They can't just take it." "They already filed the paperwork," Jack said. "But I'm not letting it stand." Margaret disappeared into the back room and returned with a worn leather folder. "These are the original deeds. Not copies. Henry kept them locked in a safe for decades. Go through every page." Jack accepted the folder carefully, the leather warm in his hands. Inside were yellowed pages with ornate lettering, each one documenting how another piece of land had been added to the Mercer holdings. Proof of just how hard his family had fought to hold onto it. Before he left, Margaret placed a hand on his arm. "This isn't just about dirt, Jack. It's about respect. If they take this from you, they'll think they can do it to anyone." On the drive back, her words echoed in his mind. Losing the land would mean losing the ground his family had defended for nearly a century, and letting people believe they had the right to take whatever they wanted. But Jack also knew history had a way of leaving behind hidden tools. He was certain he hadn't uncovered them all yet. 2 days later, Jack parked across from the Cedar Bluff Estates Community Center, a small brick building where the HOA held its meetings. Tuesday evenings, the board gathered behind closed doors. Jack had called earlier, asking to attend, but the secretary cut him off. "You're not a member, Mr. Mercer. These aren't public." That was fine. He didn't come to listen. He came to watch. From his truck, he spotted Priscilla Whitmore stepping out of a sleek black Lexus, tall and composed in a cream blazer and pearl earrings. She carried herself like she owned every room she entered. At her side was a man Jack recognized, Ethan Walsh, a local realtor who had brokered land for the subdivision years ago. Ethan looked uneasy, glancing around before trailing after her inside. Jack's mind kept circling the same question: How had they managed this? The county clerk confirmed the sale had been filed, which meant someone had created documents convincing enough to slip through the system. He suspected Ethan had a hand in it, but suspicion wasn't proof. The next morning, Jack called Angela at the clerk's office again. "Is there a way to see who signed the sale documents?" "Yes," she said, "but you'll need to request a certified copy. Want me to pull it for you?" "Please." By noon, Jack was at the counter with a folder in hand. The sale agreement was 3 pages long. There it was, in black ink, the HOA listed as seller, Cedar Bluff Estates Development Group as buyer, and the signature authorizing the deal, Priscilla Whitmore, HOA president. His jaw locked. On the next page, an abandonment claim, stating the land had been unused, neglected, and unpaid for more than 3 years. Nothing but lies. Anyone who drove past could see otherwise. That evening, Jack called Mark. "I've got the paperwork. Priscilla signed it herself." "Then it's time you faced her directly," Mark said. "Oh, I will," Jack promised. "But not yet. I've got more than just a copy of this," Jack told Mark over the phone. "I want her cornered with no way to wiggle out." Over the next few days, Jack noticed subtle changes up by the northern boundary. Bright orange survey flags sprouted in the grass. One afternoon, a contractor's truck idled by the fence line. Jack walked right over and leaned on the window. "You working for the developer?" he asked. The young guy with a clipboard shifted nervously. Yeah, just marking spots for some preliminary work. They said this is Phase 2 expansion." Jack crossed his arms. "This isn't their land. Make sure your boss hears that." The man shrugged, like it wasn't his fight, and drove off. Jack knew the warning wouldn't travel far. Word in Cedar Bluff County spread fast, especially when something big was stirring. By week's end, 3 different folks had stopped him at the feed store, asking if it was true he'd lost the property. Every time, Jack set them straight. "I didn't lose a damn thing," he said. "It was stolen. And I'm taking it back." One of those conversations was with Frances Doyle, a retired schoolteacher who'd lived in Cedar Bluff Estates since it was first built. She leaned close, lowering her voice. "Jack, I don't know if this helps, but I've seen Priscilla holding late-night meetings at her place. Ethan's been there more than once, and so has a man from the developer's office. Folks say they'd been planning to, well, reallocate land for months." That word made Jack's stomach knot. Reallocate. A polished way of saying steal. Back at the ranch, Jack pulled out the old leather folder Margaret had given him. If the HOA could spin lies, he could counter them with facts, real, documented history. That night he spread deeds, tax receipts, and land maps across the table, the yellow light pooling over them. That was when he spotted something he'd missed before, a small note, handwritten in his father's script, attached to a subdivision map. "Acquired mineral and ground rights for Blocks 3 to 7, 1990. Blocks 3 through 7, that covered a massive section of Cedar Bluff Estates. Dozens of houses, all sitting on land the Mercers actually owned beneath the surface. Jack leaned back, the air in the room feeling suddenly heavier. The HOA thought they'd stripped him of everything, but they had no clue they'd been living on his family's land for decades. But before he acted, Jack needed certainty. That meant finding the original documents, proof the rights were still valid. The next morning, he drove an hour to the County Records Archive in Lufkin. The old limestone building stood tall with wide steps and oak doors, the kind of place where history didn't just rest, it gathered dust, waiting for someone stubborn enough to dig it out. Inside, a clerk named Royce Flannery looked up with a weary smile. "What brings you in today, Mr. Mercer?" "I'm looking for a land rights agreement from 1990, Jack said, sliding the folded note across the counter. "Blocks 3 through 7, Cedar Bluff Estates subdivision. Should be under Richard Mercer." Royce pushed his glasses up, frowning at the slip of paper. "That's basement vault material. Not digitized. Give me a minute." Jack followed him down a narrow stairwell lined with steel cabinets that looked older than both of them. Royce flipped through thick ledgers, fingers brushing over yellowed pages until he pulled out a heavy leather-bound record book. Inside was the original deed transfer, notarized, signed, and county-stamped. It clearly spelled out that Richard Mercer owned the mineral and ground rights to those blocks, with no expiration. Jack's pulse jumped. This wasn't just leverage, it was a hammer. On paper, he owned the ground under those homes. Every homeowner in blocks 3 to 7, including Priscilla, was technically his tenant. Back at the ranch, he spread the documents across the kitchen table and called Ben. "You sitting down?" Jack asked. "Yeah. Why?" "I've got the original deed. Blocks 3 to 7. Still valid." There was a pause before Ben let out a long whistle. "You know what that means, right? They tried to steal your land, but they've been living on yours this whole time." That night, Jack's phone rang again. The number was unfamiliar. He answered cautiously. "Mr. Mercer? This is Elena Vargas from the Cedar Bluff Chronicle. I'm working on a story about your dispute with the HOA. Would you be willing to comment?" "Depends what you've heard," Jack replied. "I've heard your land was sold to a developer for unpaid dues. But I've also heard you were never part of the HOA." "That's correct," Jack said. "And I've got proof they had no right to touch my land. That's all I'm saying for now." Elena pressed for more, but Jack kept his answers short. He wasn't about to reveal his hand too early. Still, the fact that the local paper was sniffing around meant this story was moving beyond whispers. The next few days brought more signs of pressure. One morning, Jack found a fresh, "No trespassing" sign nailed to the fence along the subdivision line, on his side. The wood was still raw, the letters sprayed in black paint instead of the county's neat stencil. Later that afternoon, he drove past a driveway where several HOA board members were huddled together, talking in low tones. They went silent as his truck rolled by, staring at him. One of them, Graham Fielding, gave him a smile so thin it was almost a threat. That evening, Mark stopped over. "They're nervous," he said. "I've been hearing chatter from a buddy in the estates. Priscilla's telling folks you're just stirring trouble to block development." Jack snorted. "Progress for who? Sure isn't the people being taxed out of their homes." He knew their game: twist the story, control the narrative, turn the victim into the villain. But this time, the facts were on his side. If he played it right, the truth would come out in a way they couldn't bury. One afternoon, while checking fence lines along the north pasture, Jack spotted a man in a suit standing by the corner lot. He matched Francis Doyle's description, a developer's rep. Jack walked up slowly. "Can I help you?" he asked. The man smiled politely, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Just inspecting some property." "This is my property," Jack said flatly. The man glanced at his clipboard. "According to our records." "Your records are wrong," Jack cut in. "And you'd better fix them before you find yourself on the wrong side of a courtroom." The man didn't argue. He snapped his folder shut and walked briskly to his car. Jack watched him drive off, the weight of that deed heavy in his mind, like a loaded rifle waiting to be used. He'd been patient, collecting facts, staying calm, but he could feel the tide shifting. The HOA and their allies thought they held all the cards. They were about to learn they'd been standing on shaky ground the whole time. Before Jack made his first public move, though, there was one more conversation he wanted, face-to-face with Priscilla Whitmore herself. That Friday evening, Jack parked his truck in front of the Whitmore residence. The sun dipped low, shadows stretching across the manicured lawns of Cedar Bluff Estates. Priscilla's two-story brick home stood tall on the corner of Rosemont Drive, every hedge clipped to perfection, every porch light glowing warm. He'd called earlier, leaving a message with her assistant, asking for a meeting. She hadn't replied. But tonight, he wasn't leaving without being heard. Jack knew that showing up in person would leave Priscilla with little room to dodge. As he stepped out of his truck, he spotted a shadow moving behind the sheer curtains in her front window. A moment later, the door opened. Priscilla Whitmore stood in the doorway, one hand resting on the frame, the other holding a crystal glass of white wine. "Mr. Mercer," she said smoothly, her tone polite but clipped. "I wasn't expecting company. I figured you wouldn't mind, considering you've been handling my business without my permission," Jack replied. Her eyes flickered, just for a second, before she gestured toward the porch. "I'll give you 5 minutes." They stood there with the low hum of sprinklers filling the silence. "You sold my land," Jack began. "You knew I wasn't part of your HOA, and you filed that sale like I'd abandoned it." Priscilla sipped her wine, slow and deliberate. "The land wasn't being used to its full potential. Development will bring growth to this community. My family's been working that land for almost a century," Jack said. "And I've got proof you've been sitting on property that belongs to me. Blocks 3 through 7. I own the ground you live on, Priscilla." Her glass froze halfway to her lips. "That's impossible." Jack pulled a folded copy of the original 1990 deed from his jacket pocket and held it out. "Take a look." She skimmed the page, her polished composure slipping just enough for Jack to notice the tightening of her shoulders. "That's a technicality," she said finally, her voice quieter. "It's the law," Jack shot back. "And unless you undo what you've done, I'll start exercising my landlord rights. Evictions. Rent demands. Whatever it takes." Her gaze hardened. "You're bluffing." Jack stepped off the porch and headed for his truck. "You'll find out soon enough." That night, back at his kitchen table, Jack spread his father's papers out again. He wanted to make sure there were no holes in his claim. Margaret's folder was a goldmine of records, tax receipts stretching back decades, mineral rights agreements, boundary surveys. But one envelope stood out. It was labeled in Richard's handwriting, HOA property deal, keep. Inside was a letter from Charles Behrens, the original developer who built Cedar Bluff Estates. Dated April 1990, it confirmed that in exchange for allowing roads to be laid through part of the ranch, Richard Mercer had been granted perpetual rights to certain subdivision blocks. Charles had even included a hand-drawn map marking the exact plots. Jack let out a long breath. This wasn't just leverage. This was airtight. The HOA itself had been built on a deal that made his father their landlord. The next morning, Jack called Ben. "I'm ready to move." "You sure?" "Once you pull the trigger, there's no going back," Ben warned. "I've been sure since the day they tried to steal my land. Now I've got the paperwork to bury their argument." Before making a public move, Jack called Elena from the Chronicle. "I've got something you'll want to see," he told her. "But I'll only show you if you run the story straight, no spin." "I'm listening," she said. They met at a diner off Highway 287. Jack slid the envelope across the table. Elena read every page, her eyes widening. "This changes everything," she murmured. "If this holds up, the HOA could be in serious trouble." "It's solid," Jack replied. "Every page checks out. I want people to know what really happened before they try painting me as some bitter rancher standing in the way of progress." By the time Jack left the diner, he knew the clock had started ticking. Once Elena's story hit the front page, the HOA would scramble to spin it. But he wasn't worried. He'd been patient, gathering proof while they believed he was cornered. Now it was his turn. Before the article went live, Jack made one decisive legal move, something that would hit harder than any headline. By Monday morning, he was sitting in the office of his attorney, Reed Jameson. Reed was tall, with silver hair and a calm, steady voice that made judges lean forward when he spoke. He specialized in property disputes. After flipping through the documents, Reed looked up. "They picked the wrong man. We'll file a petition to void the sale immediately. But I'm also advising we initiate landlord action on blocks 3 through 7. That'll show them just how deep this runs." Jack nodded. "Do it. I'm ready." The petition was filed that same afternoon. But Jack wasn't finished. He wanted to look Priscilla in the eye again, this time in front of her board. The HOA's monthly meeting was set for Tuesday evening. They'd barred him before, but this time, Jack arrived early and stood by the entrance. A few board members shot him uneasy glances as they walked in. Priscilla arrived last, stepping out of her Lexus with her usual air of control. But when her eyes landed on Jack, her stride faltered. "This is a members-only meeting," she said coolly. "I'm here as your landlord," Jack replied, holding up a certified copy of the 1990 deed. The words landed like a hammer. A couple of members stopped mid-step, trading confused looks. Priscilla tried to sweep past him, but Jack followed her inside. "Let's make this formal," he said. "You tried to sell my ranch under false claims. But you've been living on my land for 30 years. That makes everyone in blocks 3 through 7 my tenants, whether they realized it or not." The room froze. Ethan Walsh's jaw worked, like he was scrambling for the right words. "That's absurd," Ethan finally said. "The subdivision was built fair and square. Read the original agreement," Jack countered, sliding the deed across the table. "Your fair and square sits on Mercer land." Priscilla's voice turned sharp. "You think you can scare us with old paperwork? This is a community, Mr. Mercer. People built their lives here. And my family built theirs on the ranch you just tried to steal," Jack shot back. "The difference is, I have the law behind me." The tension was thick. A couple of board members flipped through the deed, whispering. One of them, Clinton Avery, finally looked up. "If this holds up in court, we're in trouble." Priscilla's glare could have cut glass. "We'll see what a judge says." "Oh, you will," Jack said, heading for the door. "And in the meantime, you might want to warn your neighbors to expect some letters in the mail." The very next morning, Reed filed the landlord notices. They weren't eviction letters, not yet, but formal rent demands, backdated 3 months. Each one carried Jack's name at the top and the legal description of the land beneath each home. Within 2 days, Jack's phone rang nonstop. Some calls were furious homeowners demanding to know if it was a joke. Others were nervous, asking if they could meet with him to work something out. Jack stayed calm with every response. "Take it up with your HOA president." One evening, Francis Doyle called again. "They're panicking, Jack. People are talking about removing Priscilla from the board. They feel blindsided." "They should," Jack said simply. "She put them in this mess." Meanwhile, Elena's article hit the front page of the Chronicle. The headline blared, "Local rancher fights HOA over land, legal landlord to dozens of homes." The story laid it all out, from the suspicious sale of his 1,500 acres to the decades-old deed giving him rights under the subdivision. A photo of Jack leaning against his fence filled half the page. Another showed Priscilla looking rattled outside the HOA office. By week's end, TV stations were knocking on Jack's door. He gave one short statement, his tone measured. "This isn't about revenge. It's about accountability. When people abuse power, they need to answer for it." But privately, Jack knew it was also about proving they couldn't bully him into silence. They'd crossed the line, and he was prepared to fight to the bitter end. Just as pressure mounted on the HOA, Jack learned the developer wasn't backing down. 2 days after the article broke, Reed called with an update. His voice was calm, but heavy. "They've hired a big Dallas law firm," Reed said. "And this time, it's not the HOA filing. The developer's name is on the motion. They're stepping in to defend the sale, and they're arguing you don't have standing to challenge it." Jack leaned against his kitchen counter, phone pressed tight to his ear. "No standing?" "They tried to steal my land. They're arguing you abandoned it," Reed explained calmly. "And they're claiming your mineral and ground rights to the subdivision blocks aren't relevant to this case. They want the court to see those as two completely separate matters." Jack paced the floor, his boots heavy against the wood. "So they're trying to cut the legs out from under me." "That's exactly what they're doing," Reed said. "But here's where we hit back. If we tie those two issues together, we can prove they acted in bad faith on both fronts. That's when your leverage becomes powerful." Later that day, Jack met Reed downtown. Spread across the conference table were stacks of documents, property maps, tax receipts, old letters between the Mercers and county officials. Reed pointed to a highlighted section in the 1990 agreement. "This clause is gold," Reed said, tapping the page. "It states your rights to blocks 3 through 7 are perpetual and transferable. That means they can't be split from the land. That's the connection we need. If the judge sees they ignored this clause when they filed the sale, it proves intent. They tried to cut you out completely." Jack leaned back in his chair, letting that sink in. He thought of his father at their kitchen table, pen in hand, refusing to sign anything unless it protected the family long after he was gone. Richard had been right. That insistence might be the very thing saving the ranch now. The first hearing was set for Wednesday at the Cedar Bluff County Courthouse. Jack arrived early, wearing a crisp white shirt, pressed jeans, and his father's old belt buckle, a reminder of why he was there. Priscilla and Ethan sat at the defense table, their attorneys whispering in low tones. Across the aisle, 2 slick lawyers for the developer scrolled their tablets, barely acknowledging Jack. When the judge entered, Reed rose and presented the petition to void the sale. He walked the court through the Mercer family's history on the ranch, the HOA's false abandonment claim, and the 1990 agreement that tied Jack directly to the subdivision land. The opposing attorney objected, insisting the subdivision rights were irrelevant to the case. Reed didn't flinch. "Your Honor, the so-called real matter is that my client's land was sold without his consent. These rights demonstrate a clear pattern of the defendants disregarding his legal ownership. It isn't a distraction. It's the very heart of the case." The judge allowed the evidence in. Priscilla kept her gaze fixed forward, but Jack noticed her fingers tightening against the edge of the table. As the hearing ended and people filed out, Ethan brushed past Jack and muttered, "You're making a lot of enemies, Mercer." Jack didn't slow down. "You made that choice for me when you signed a lie." Outside, Elena was waiting with a cameraman. "How do you feel about today's hearing?" she asked. "Like we're just getting started," Jack said. "They thought I'd be too small to fight back. They were wrong." That evening, Reed called again. "We've got a window," he said. "The judge hasn't ruled yet, but she's allowing us to submit additional evidence before next week. Photos, receipts, witness statements, the more, the better." Jack thought of Mark, Francis, Margaret, even the young contractor he'd confronted by the fence. Every one of them had seen something that contradicted the HOA's lies. If they were willing to speak on record, it could be the final push they needed. The next day, Jack began knocking on doors. Not to threaten, just to listen. Neighbors recalled seeing him working the land, tending cattle, repairing fences. Francis even dug out old photographs from a 4th of July picnic on the North Pasture, just 2 years ago. By Friday, Reed's office was stacked with proof. For the first time since that stranger in the polo shirt handed him the envelope, Jack felt the tide turning in his favor. Then came a letter that stopped him cold. It arrived in a heavy cream envelope, the kind meant to look official. Jack slit it open with his pocket knife. Inside were 3 typed pages from the developer's lawyers. They were offering him a lump sum for the entire 1,500 acres. The number was big enough to tempt someone who only saw land as dirt and grass. But Jack saw it for what it was, a buyout designed to end the fight without admitting fault. He read it twice, then called Reed. "They think I can be bought," Jack said flatly. Reed gave a dry chuckle. "If they're offering this early, it means they know the ground is slipping beneath them. And the number's high enough to show they're worried." "I'm not interested," Jack said. "I don't want their money. I want my land back. And I want them to know what it feels like to lose." 2 days later, the judge issued her ruling on the petition. The sale of Jack's ranch was voided pending a full trial. The developer's plans were frozen, and the county clerk was ordered to restore the title to Jack's name until the case concluded. It wasn't the final victory, but it was a blow the HOA and developer hadn't seen coming so soon. The very next morning, Jack and Reed moved forward with the landlord action. Official notices were delivered to every home in blocks 3 through 7. The language was clear: rental terms to be negotiated within 30 days, or eviction proceedings would begin. By midday, The subdivision was buzzing with tension. Cars lined driveways, neighbors huddled on sidewalks, phones lit up with news alerts. By evening, Jack's name was trending across local social media. Some posts hailed him as a folk hero, standing up to a power-hungry HOA. Others, mostly from inside the subdivision, called him greedy and vindictive. At dusk, there was a knock at Jack's door. It was Clinton Avery, the board member who'd spoken cautiously during the meeting. Hat in hand, he shifted on the porch. "Mr. Mercer, I think it's fair to say things have gotten out of hand," Clinton said. "A lot of folks didn't know about any of this. They trusted Priscilla. And look where that got them," Jack replied. "This could have been avoided if your board hadn't let her run unchecked." Clinton swallowed. "Is there a way to resolve this without people losing their homes?" Jack studied him. "I'm not looking to throw out anyone willing to make things right. But I'm not letting this HOA pretend they didn't try to steal what's mine." Meanwhile, Francis Doyle called again with fresh news. The board had scheduled an emergency meeting to discuss removing Priscilla as president. The rent notices had shaken too many homeowners. 3 nights later, the vote was held. Priscilla was out. Ethan resigned soon after, citing personal reasons. Neither of them spoke publicly, but word was they'd both hired lawyers of their own. The shift in leadership changed everything. Sharon Bell, the acting president, called Reed directly. She proposed a settlement. The HOA would issue a formal apology, acknowledge Jack's rights to blocks 3 through 7, and agree never to challenge his ownership of the ranch again. In return, Jack would drop the landlord action against residents who signed rental acknowledgments within 10 business days. It wasn't everything Jack wanted. There'd be no admission of wrongdoing for the false abandonment claim. But it was a public surrender on the points that mattered most. Reed laid it out clearly. "This deal restores your land, your rights, and puts them in your debt. The rest you win in reputation." Jack thought it over that night. By morning, he agreed. Not because he wanted to let the HOA off easy, but because his father had taught him to know when a fight was already won. The day the agreement was signed, local cameras rolled as Jack stood on the courthouse steps. "This isn't just about me," he told them. "It's about standing up when someone in power thinks they can walk over you. You don't let that slide. Not for a day, not for $1. As the cameras clicked, he spotted homeowners from the estates in the crowd. Some nodded in quiet respect. Others still looked wary. Jack knew trust wouldn't come quickly, but trust wasn't his goal. His goal was to protect what was his, and make sure no one ever tried to take it again. But the story wasn't quite over. The fallout from Priscilla's downfall would ripple through Cedar Bluff County in ways Jack hadn't yet imagined. In the weeks that followed, the county felt different. You could hear it in conversations at the feed store, or notice it when chatter paused at the hardware shop the moment Jack walked in. Some looked at him with respect. Others with suspicion. But no one looked at him like he was just another rancher anymore. Priscilla's absence left a vacuum. And without her iron grip, the HOA was suddenly wide open. Homeowners started voicing complaints that had been bottled up for years, about climbing fees, unfair rule enforcement, and spending that no one could trace. Sharon Bell tried to steer the board toward transparency, but the fractures were already deep. Some residents even turned on her, accusing her of folding to Jack. At one meeting, a man stood up and shouted, "We got steamrolled by one guy with a cowboy hat and a grudge." Jack heard about it the next day from Francis, who repeated the line with a smirk. "Sounds like you've got yourself a new nickname in the estates." "I've been called worse," Jack said. Outwardly, he shrugged it off, but privately, the label gnawed at him. He didn't want to be seen as just a symbol of resistance. His fight had been about more than making a point, it was about defending his family's legacy. Not everyone in the subdivision held bitterness. A number of residents from blocks 3 through 7 drove out to the ranch to meet him face to face. One older couple, the Beldens, arrived carrying a homemade pecan pie. "We just wanted to thank you for not putting us out," Mrs. Belden said softly. "We had no idea any of this was happening." I know you didn't, Jack told her. The people you trusted put you in a bad spot. I'm not here to punish families for the board's choices. I'm here to make sure it never happens again. Still, the settlement didn't wipe every scar. The developer pulled out of Cedar Bluff Estates quietly, but not before selling off other parcels nearby. Word spread that they were regrouping, hunting for easier targets in other counties. Reed warned Jack to stay alert. Once a company plays this game, they don't stop. They just move on to softer ground. Meanwhile, Elena's article took on a life of its own. State papers picked it up, framing Jack's fight as a rare case of one rancher standing up to both an HOA and a developer, and winning. Letters started arriving in Jack's mailbox from across Texas. People shared their own stories of being bullied by HOAs or losing family land to loopholes. Some asked for advice, others just wanted to say they were cheering him on. One letter stayed with him. It came from a man in Eastland County whose grandparents had lost their farm in the 70s to a phony abandonment claim. We didn't know our rights, and we didn't have the means to fight. You did what we couldn't. Thank you. Jack tucked that letter into the same leather folder that held his father's deeds. It was a reminder that this battle hadn't been fought in isolation. The HOA was forced to hold a community-wide meeting to explain the settlement. Sharon Bell stood at the front, reading from a prepared statement. She acknowledged Jack's rights to blocks 3 through 7 and confirmed that the 1,500 acres belonged solely to him. Jack stood quietly at the back of the room. Some homeowners looked at him with guarded expressions, others with relief. Afterward, a younger man approached. Mr. Mercer, he said, extending a hand. Name's Eli Cormack. I'll be honest, I didn't like you when this started. Thought you were just trying to tear down our neighborhood. But after hearing it all, I get it now. Jack gave a small nod. That's all I ever needed you to do. Understand. Life at the ranch slowly returned to its rhythm. Mornings spent mending fences. Afternoons with the cattle. Evenings on the porch with a mug of coffee. Yet sometimes, when he looked toward the horizon, he caught sight of the subdivision rooftops and streetlights. It wasn't smugness he felt, it was a quiet reminder of the balance he'd fought to restore. In town, people still talked about the case months later. For some, it was a cautionary tale of overreaching power. For others, a rallying cry to protect what was theirs. Either way, Jack knew his name would always be tied to that fight. But as the dust settled, his mind shifted less to what was behind him and more to the lesson left standing. A truth his father had lived by and one Jack intended to pass on. On a warm spring morning, he finally let himself exhale. The court filings were closed. The ranch was legally secure. The subdivision had accepted his ownership of the ground beneath their homes. For the first time in months, there was no envelope on his porch, no stranger at the gate, no meeting to prepare for. He sat on the back porch, coffee in hand, watching the pasture grass ripple in the breeze. The cattle grazed in the distance, and the air smelled faintly of wildflowers. It was the kind of quiet Richard had loved, the kind where you could hear your own thoughts. Mid-morning, Margaret stopped by with a jar of her homemade blackberry jam. She set it on the table, gazing out over the land. You did it, she said simply. Jack smiled. We did it. You gave me the folder that turned the whole thing around. Margaret shook her head. I just passed you the past. You're the one who knew what to do with it. They sat for a while, talking about Henry and Richard, about lean years when the only steady thing they had was the land. It struck Jack then, this fight was never just about winning in court. It was about honoring the sacrifices that had come before. That afternoon, while loading feed into his truck, Eli Cormack spotted him. Mind if I ask you something? Eli said, walking over. Go ahead. If you could go back to before all this started, would you still fight it? Jack didn't hesitate. Every time. You can't put a price on what's yours when it's tied to who you are. Once you let someone take it, you'll never get it back. Eli nodded slowly. Guess I needed to hear that. On the drive home, Jack passed the sign for Cedar Bluff Estates. White paint, neat flowers at its base, just like always. But to him, it meant something different now. It wasn't just a marker of where the subdivision began. It was proof that even the most polished facades could hide cracks, and that if you knew where to look, you could widen those cracks with the truth. The months that followed were calmer. He still had occasional talks with residents about rental agreements, but most kept to themselves. Some even came by to buy beef straight from the ranch. The relationships weren't warm, exactly, but they were civil. That was enough for Jack. One summer evening, Ben showed up with a cooler of beer. They sat on the porch, watching the sun dip low. "You know," Ben said, "you could have taken that developer's offer and been set for life. No one would have blamed you." Jack took a sip, shaking his head. "Maybe. But money comes and goes. This land, it's the one thing my family bled for. It's the one thing I can pass down that can't be spent away." Ben grinned. "You're a stubborn man." "Guess it runs in the family," Jack replied. The story eventually slipped from the headlines, replaced by the next fight in another county. But in Cedar Bluff, people remembered. At the diner, whenever someone brought it up, it was always with a shake of the head and a remark about that rancher who turned the tables. For Jack, the takeaway was simple: power only works if people are too tired or too afraid to stand up. Once you rise, even against something bigger than yourself, the balance shifts. And sometimes, that's all it takes to win. That night, before heading inside, Jack walked out to the fence line. In the distance, subdivision lights glowed, and faint laughter drifted from a backyard. He wasn't bitter. In fact, he felt the opposite, a calm satisfaction that came from knowing he'd done right by those who came before him, and by the land they entrusted to him. He rested his hand on the top rail and whispered, more to himself than to anyone else, "This stays Mercer land. Always." And that was the lesson he hoped others would carry from his story, that some things are worth more than the highest check, and that standing your ground, even when you're alone, can be the strongest legacy you leave behind. If you're hearing this and you've got something worth protecting, your land, your name, your principles, don't wait for someone else to defend it. Stand up, speak out, and make sure it stays yours. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe, because there's always another fight worth telling.